we've got some really fantastic panelists today. Thank you everyone for joining and taking the time. While we're going through the panelist presentations, if everybody who is not a panelist could turn off their cameras and mute themselves, just to keep background noise to a minimum. If you are a panelist, please keep your cameras on so that people know who's talking and who they're posing questions to and things like that. Okay, oh, I can see Rebecca is on as well. Fantastic. All of our panelists, it looks like, are here. So great news. Okay, so let's get started. So the subject for today is Build Back Better. This is the second session that we've done on this topic. The first session that we did drew a lot of information from a local survey that we put out, where we asked local people and local organisations to complete the survey and to give us ideas on what they think's been a good sort of outcome of COVID and positive, like the community input and the community feel that has been sort of cultivated following on from the pandemic, but also a whole load of other ideas, some to do with the climate crisis, some to do with how our government services run, some to do with, you know, track and trace and actually tackling the pandemic. So today we're looking again at local issues, and we have 4 great panelists. So we are going to start with Will Mansell. Will founded the Foodbank and now runs a series of social enterprises in Wickham, including the Long Table, the Furniture Bank, Kids Stuff and Kickoff, which, I mean, the ones that I know of are absolutely fantastic enterprises, and I've no doubt that this is going to be a really interesting session. So they are in the NatWest SE 100 2019 Social Enterprises Top 100 as a Top 100 National Social Enterprise. So, Will, thank you very much for joining us, and if you'd like to do your 10-minute presentation.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Well, thanks, Jenny, for the introduction. It's quite nice what you said there. My mum must have written it for someone to say about nice things. Yeah, so I work at a little group called Grace Network, which is a network of social enterprises. We're a community benefit society, so we're democratically owned. And our raison d'etre initially, many moons ago, was about life-changing opportunity through enterprise. And that was very much focused on individuals. And so tonight's topic is thinking about how we build back better. And I think with recent experience over the last few months of COVID, but also a number of years worth of engagement with social enterprise and how we try and make real change, my main suggestion is that as a community, what we have to try and work out is how we do community-based response as opposed to individual-based response. So by that, I mean, when we set up Grace Network, the mindset was there are lots of young people particularly, so the government calls them NEETs, people not in education, employment or training. And the sort of concept that I've been introduced to through youth work type activities was that these young people had somehow failed in life. Maybe they'd got in trouble at school, maybe they'd got in trouble with the police or doing drugs, and therefore in order to try and help them grow into good citizens, Grace Network perceived its job to create a really good opportunity through work. But what we didn't realize at the time is we'd slipped into the neoliberal myth that we're all islands of rational human beings, and therefore any failure in life was nearly always down to the fault of the individual. And therefore the response of Grace Network was, if we can make a job for an individual, that individual will get the job, they'll get growing skills and whatnot, and then move on. But I think what we've come to realize over the past few years, and particularly accelerated over the last few months, is that if we want to build back better, one of the core things we have to try and focus on is community resilience. So by community resilience, I think I'd define that as something around a group connected together. It can be a geographic or a network, so it can be a type of people, or it can be a specific geographic group that has a depth of trust that allow risks to be taken, plans to be rewritten, and hard conversations to be had in a time of chaos. As we were just waiting to start this, some people were talking about the climate emergency. What COVID's shown us is almost the ghost of Christmas future of potential global chaos. And if we're going to be able to build sustainable economies in the midst of that, we have to have this thing, community resilience, where we're able to trust each other and therefore make rapid changes without having to consult in the way you would if you didn't know the people. And so I think if we want to think about how we build back better as a political system, as an economic system, as a social system, we have to think, how do we build community resilience? The second thing I think we need to really focus on is about economic resilience. Clearly, this is about building back better and the economy. So economic resilience is the key. And by that, I think we have to start thinking a bit more about how we procure and manage and share resources within a localized environment, particularly hyperlocal seems the way forward. One of the things that was revealed during COVID was that it was hyperlocal communities that were best able to look after each other resource-wise, i.e. if you had a neighbour, they could get you food. If you had a supermarket within walking distance, you could get there easily. And so as we deal with increasingly chaotic economic and social shocks, having very hyperlocal groups feels like one of the best ways to protect ourselves. And I guess as I'm speaking to a Green Party group, most of you will know Kate's Haworth's donut economics, economic theory, rewriting the way we consider economics. A lot of the way we've been building our economy is based on people like David Ricardo, who are hundreds of years out of date, and therefore we have to start getting better metaphors for the 21st century. And by doing that, using the concept of community resilience and economic resilience, I think we can build back better by getting much better frameworks with which to make economic decisions and plans. So from a Grace Network perspective, excuse me, sorry, thinking about, again, that donut economics model, we're increasingly focused as we try and build back better on two of the areas that economic theory misses out the most, which have been absolutely demonstrated during COVID as vital. One of those is the household economy, and the other one is the commons economy. So thinking about some of the work of Eleanor Ostrom and the way in which common goods can be shared effectively without massive state intervention or privatization, those two areas during lockdown, again, have become more important than ever. The home economy, or the household economy, which is always forgotten in mainstream economics, became suddenly a fulcrum of economic survival. If you couldn't look after your children because there was one of you, or you didn't live near your family, or didn't have any connections, just existing in the last 4, 5, 6 months has been absolutely nightmarish. The education system we have is effectively a massive childcare system, but the economy didn't realize that that was what it was doing. The moment you took that out, you had all these pressures that meant that the economy couldn't work. So long before furlough was coming, we were told by our staff, we won't be able to work because I've got to look after my kids. So Grace Network's putting a lot of effort now in community building around the household. So we have a concept of spaces, different areas in which people can come and be in our warehouses, in our environments. And one of them we call the refectory, a place of eating. And so actually regularly eating together provides a function that's normally held in the household privately, i.e. eating your food. But we're recognizing that eating together as a community strengthens the bonds of that community, thus building community resilience, but also allows some of the household economics. Lots of my staff used to use Foodbank, so food's always been a problem. You can solve that household problem of when they're going to eat by eating collectively. And it's much, much cheaper and much, much nicer than a food bank, which takes an individualized approach of just giving someone some food and saying, see you later. So in terms of building back better, thinking about ways in which we can engage the household in the local economy, supporting particularly primary carers who tend to be women, is a vital next step. So we have to think about protecting those household leaders, whether they're men or women, or whether they're staying at home full-time or two people working part-time, or whatever the case might be. We have to think about how we can protect that. And then the second thing is about common assets. So this is about the commons, and thinking about how we manage resources that are actually collective much better. We're currently working in a piece of land owned by the district council, which lends itself to be a common resource, because actually the council has a far more public-minded mindset than private investors. And therefore we need to think about that. So in terms of practical next steps, calls for support, what can we do to actually build back better? We're just writing our own little white paper, which is a bold term for what's 2 sides of A4. And we've got a number of points. One of them is we need to find ways of providing core funding for social businesses. At the moment, you're in an uncertain circumstance. Finding core funding for social businesses is an absolute vital next step if we want to see them grow. And that feeds into the wider suggestion that the capital market for social investment needs to grow massively if we're going to see a Build Back Better. Raising money for social good has traditionally been in the sphere of charitable giving, but that is just an inappropriate way of doing it. We need locally to encourage local investment, hyperlocal, between citizen to citizen, that can invest in good ideas. I know Anna's got an idea she might share later in the chat about a new bike business. And I think that's the sort of business that, if you want to see real change, needs capital, and that's going to have to come from individuals. The second bit we need after finance and core support is to really think about how we can give authority to communities to go forward. And authority is a very subtle problem, because you can get authority through prestige. So we've just completed this project called Feeding the 5,000 during COVID, where we fed lots of people through Long Table. One of the core elements that made that work was the Bishop of Gloucester lent us her authority, which meant she called people up. What's fascinating in a pandemic is no one knows who's in charge, and a bishop sounds like they should be. So as a title, it was absolutely beautiful to say the bishop wants to speak to you, and in the midst of no other people in charge, people thought she should be, perhaps. And she lent us her authority, which allowed us to open doors that we otherwise couldn't be. So we need to try and encourage the powers that be, whether they're political or economic, to lend their own authority to new and upcoming social enterprises. Otherwise, you can't get to the seat of power. And then finally, before my 10 minutes is up, I think we need to focus on providing longer term studies of change. One of the things Grace Network's been terrible at is really evidence-basing how a social business can change a life. And I think if we want to build back better, we have to get better at doing research, because it's only through research combined with frameworks like donut economics, etc., you can then use that to leverage policy at a national level, which is obviously a long-term goal. So in a nutshell, I think the way forward to build back better is more community resilience, which is based around being with your community, spending time with each other, communal meals, communal activities, old-fashioned fetes and fairs, combined with economic resilience, which is talking about trying to procure as much as you can within your hyperlocal context, which is moving against the big mass production models. And to do that really well, we'll need more capital, which needs to be raised, and we'll need to get more authority, and then finally more evidence to prove how it works. And that's my 10 minutes.
Fantastic. Will, thank you so much for that. A really succinct round, donut-shaped presentation, I think. There you go. So yeah, really interesting points: community resilience, economic resilience, both of these huge subjects coming through the pandemic. I know that community resilience seems to have had a huge spike within this pandemic period. We heard from District Councillor Catherine Braun from Wootton Under Edge on the amazing stuff that's going on with mutual aid there last time, and this seems to sort of follow on from that and identify it really well. You're right, we need to start helping each other. We need real localization. We need to start supporting our own farmers, create our own food networks. All of those kinds of things need to start coming together. I think really interesting points on lending authority. I think you're right. I think a lot of people who are in positions of power actually haven't used their authority well, and so you've seen individuals who might have not necessarily been on that front line before step up to the plate. And I mean, I'm on Stonehouse Town Council, and I know that there's a lot of unexpected characters that have really come out of their shells during this period, and it's been really amazing to see. Great to hear about the Bishop stepping up and lending her name in that situation. Okay, if there's any specific, Anna. Okay, Anna, if you'd like to unmute yourself and just pop on for 2 minutes to talk about a project that you are doing with Will.
Yeah, thank you very much. Will and I have only spoken about this once, so I wanted to sort of interject and just to say that Will and I are totally aligned in our views on this, in terms of social enterprise and bringing communities together in places that are incredibly localised. We have already begun with the Access Bike project that I'm hoping a lot of you are familiar with, to volunteer to pick up and deliver food and other supplies to people who've until now been shielding or isolating, and it's going really, really well. We've got a bunch of young people in very much in the same vein as Access Bike, It's all completely youth-led, and we just lend our support to it, to helping them do what they need to do. Our phase 1, which we're in currently at the moment, is to pick up and deliver local deliveries. We're working with Stroud Food Co. and Loose and many others, and it's growing all the time to do that. Phase 2 is when it starts to become interesting, and we're hoping to get that going relatively soon, certainly in the next 6 months, which is the first and last mile, so that we stop traffic going into the centre of town, and there's a depot, and deliveries are made to a central place outside of town, and the cargo bikes, which we're looking into at the moment, to funding them, do that first and last mile delivery. The sweet bit comes when in the third phase, when that is combined with picking up waste, business waste, and taking it back out to the same depot where all the Ubico and so on then pick up those waste products and take them on from there. So it's a really nice way of getting traffic out of towns, and also, as Will described, employing young people, about whom I'm incredibly worried, that age group between 18 to 25 who are transient and haven't necessarily settled into work and home life and earning a living, who are going to find that sort of casual labour very, very difficult to find. So we're working really hard on that. We've involved somebody who's a logistics expert, and we're hoping to involve Will in terms of managing depots and funding and the like. So that's very exciting. That's already happening, and I felt it was really important to tell people that that's a project that's already well underway. I just want to add also, if I may, in answer to a question from Martin about community support networks. We're working with District Council, and we've had funding to work out, and we're already some way into doing that, how we continue this incredible effort that's come locally, and organise it and make it more resilient. So we're doing a hubs project, and we're working with the Know Your Patch network, which I'm hoping everybody knows about, which is across the district, and a kind of rather too large network of social enterprise community projects and charitable organisations to support that local effort and make it much more efficient and resilient. So that's also already happening, and that's a very exciting prospect too. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks for
so
letting
much
me
for sharing that with us. That's all right. And if you've got any links to any of this information online, then please share it with us, and we'll be more than happy to share it with the people on this call today.
We kind of don't really yet. Again, it's not something organisations like us are very good at. We sort of beaver away, and we're not necessarily very good at things like that, but it is coming. So I will make sure it's shared at some point.
Okay, perfect. Whenever you're ready. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's a nice, I guess, leading on to our next presenter, who is Martin Large, who obviously posed the question that Anna just spoke to briefly there. So Martin Large's burning question is how we are building a more free, equal, mutual and earth-caring society. He's a publisher with Stroud-based Hawthorne Press for the last 38 years, and co-founded Stroud Commonwealth in 1999 for social businesses, co-ops and community land trust development. The exchange on Brick Row and shared workspace for 16 enterprises, which I'm sure has had a huge impact on the community, and I'm sure all of these different things have. So also is currently a chair on Oakbrook Community Farm, and connecting people with good food, nature and regenerative biodynamic farming. So no doubt another fascinating presentation on its way. Martin, are you there, and can you unmute yourself?
Am I here?
Yes, you're here, and there you go. Your 10 minutes starts now.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you, no problem.
Okay, fine, thank you. So do remind me, because I do go on a bit, but it's a rich feast
I'll give you
already. It's a rich feast already, and I got so many questions, and it's wonderful to hear from Will and Anna what's bubbling up, and I feel like I can retire now, because when we started Stroud Commonwealth in 1999, Alan Mossman was there, but that was one of the outcomes of Stroud's community planning process in the late 90s, which we facilitated. So we developed a community plan for Stroud, and you know what we wanted. About 1,000 people were engaged, and Lansdowne Hall was the first outcome, and a group of us, about 90 of us actually, were involved in drama. There were 3 part-time drama groups, and we needed somewhere to act, and train. So Gloucestershire County Council were going to offload Lansdowne Hall, and so we formed a not-for-profit company called Stroud Commonwealth. There is no wealth but Commonwealth. There is no wealth but life. You know, what is it to build a Commonwealth society? But it was all that behind it, so that started us off in community asset development, and then that led on to Land for People. Will talked about securing land and common property for use. And so we engaged in community land trust development. And so we engaged with all national bodies like the New Economics Foundation, the University of Salford, the government, and we developed several pilots, including what became the Cash's Green Community Land Trust. So we developed 6 pilots, and we developed a national body, communitylandtrust.org.uk, and now there are at least 350, I don't know if it's 400 yet, community land trusts nationwide. And of course, there's the Nailsworth Community Land Trust, and then there's the Eastington Community Land Trust. And our vision is a community land trust for housing and community facilities and food growing land in every village and town, you know, in Gloucestershire. That's one of our visions. So that's community asset development. And Lucas Schumacher and Max Comfort, who are 2 of our directors, are working on community-led housing, because that is a huge need, particularly with young people. And the other aspect of our work was the Social Enterprise Centre, which we set up in 2002, 2003. And Claire Madioni, who now runs the Stroud Valley Project, has facilitated loads of social enterprises and co-ops locally, followed by Aurelia St. Clair, who runs it, you know. And so what Will was talking about in terms of access to finance and also access to technical support and assistance is really important. And you know, we've got a lot of resources in our community, and how do we make use of the most of them in terms of accessing that and just finding out about it. So that's what we do. And our vision for society is we see it as a partnership between the statutory sector, Stroud District Council, the political sector, the community, NGO, cultural sector, the second leg, and the business sector, especially the social business sector. And this 3-legged stool rests, of course, on Mother Earth. Yeah, and it's all about initiative and enterprise. So that's just the context. And I think in terms of a story, we're about a great turning. We're trying to develop new stories locally. And one story from COVID-19 is the British government, which has chosen Deloitte, the accountants, to run to contract for the test and trace system. They contracted with, was it Serco and various other bodies to run that nationally, bureaucratically, topped down, and not very well. Whereas Kerala in Southwest India ran a community resilience, community health worker program, a woman minister of health, of course. She spotted COVID in early January 2020. They had a test, trace, and isolate system in Kerala in Southwest India from mid-January onwards. And I think they've only had 150 deaths in Kerala. And, you know, the family that came back from Italy, they spotted right away, you know, because they had COVID right at the airport, unlike Britain, yeah? So it's absolute, that's just shows what communities can do on very little. And I think one of the things we can do is to build back better is to use models like that for care and for local enterprise to replace the bureaucratic delivery of local services. Like I can't remember a name, Julie Wickham, I think, at Stroud. Do you know Julie, some of you? Julie Wickham is an amazing person working with Claire Madioni at Stroud Valley Project. and she runs something called GEM. And she's got, I don't know, 20 or 30 or 40 charities, and she tries to get placements for people, volunteers who've been, you know, long-term unemployed, and often, say, working in the garden at Stroud Museum for 2 hours a week will be the only time somebody gets out of the house. So that's the sort of thing we need to support and encourage, you know, that kind of volunteer program. And just think, if Stroud Valley Project had the money to hire more organisers to develop more volunteer programs, how that could be. So I'd like to sort of, so we're in a great turning how we do things, and I'd just like to finish to talk about Oakbrook Community Farm. Here's a picture of it. I don't know if you can see it. Dilly Williams' picture of Oakbrook Community Farm. What we're trying to do is to answer the question, how can we build local food security? How can we build a new local food culture? How can we provide land for young farmers to grow food on? So we've got Rosie and Nell, who are starter market gardeners. They're working under the umbrella of Stroud Community Agriculture, which is a cooperative with 290 members. And they'll be working on Oakbrook Community Farm for 2 years. And if you want your veg, just walk up to Painswick Old Road and pick up your veg there any time. Will talked about the need for research, and people have talked about the interest in climate. We've got a no-dig pilot. So on a hectare of land, we've got a no-dig research pilot. So we're experimenting and testing how much carbon we can capture using the no-dig method. And that links with a whole network of no-dig people connected with the permaculture movement in Stroud. And one of our questions is, can a hectare generate enough land for a sustainable livelihood for one grower? It would be amazing if it could. The other enterprises in Oakbrook Community Farm are things like Stroud Micro Dairy, which has 250 customers. And we've got a wonderful natural beekeeper, Christian, who keeps chasing bees around the place. It's a natural beekeeper. And what we want to also do is develop a family area for forest schools and for nature therapy and perhaps home educating groups, etc. So there's a community connection there. And there will be other enterprises starting up there. So our concept there is a bit like what Will's doing and what Anna's doing is, you know, anchor social enterprises, anchor bodies that can really provide a platform for initiative. And so that's an example of, I mean, when you think that only 7% of the apples in British shops are grown in Britain, can you imagine? And Gloucestershire is a, you know, wonderful apple county, and we've got Day's Cottage at Brookthorpe with all its wonderful apple trees there. You know, we've got an amazing opportunity to develop a resilient local food economy, but also a local food community, like Will's described, and also social enterprises. Now, Will also talked about money. Oakbrook, we kind of, Stroud Commonwealth worked on reinventing the Community Benefit Society, which is a charitable, traditional cooperative body for holding assets, and it can be charitable. So that's the structure we've chosen for Oakbrook Community Farm. And we did a community share offer for the farm, and for the tracks and for the barns and for services and common facilities. And we raised, just before COVID time, 123,000 for that, which is quite amazing generosity of 100 people investing. So we actually have the mechanisms for community reinvestment. And if only the Stroud District Council and Stroud Town Council and statutory sector could do some match funding and some seed funding, then of course we could be fund these different projects. And the last thing I'd like to sort of fly as a kite is, what we need to do is to reinvent our local economy. And this great book by John Thackeray, which I'll put the reference to it, it's got the title of How to Thrive in the Next Economy. And it's got everything from transport, energy, housing, food, clothing, water, commoning, caring, you know, in it. It's wonderful. What we need is an eco lab. You know, we need a eco enterprise hub. We need, you know, all this, you know, all these link ups to happen to share the learning and share the research and build the movement for building Stroud back better. So yeah, and the last thing, I'd love to see us developing community programs for young people in terms of conservation work, in terms of fostering their enterprise, because that's the future. So thank you.
Amazing, thank you, Martin. Another really interesting presentation. I think there's some strong key themes that are coming through: social enterprise, community investment, supporting each other, supporting small business to connect with each other and to create something that's much bigger than it can be as an individual entity. Really interesting what you was talking about. Is it Kerala in Southwest India? I mean, Dagan's put into the chat there, Rachel Smith, I know Molly's been banging this drum as well about a local track and trace system for Gloucestershire County. And I think you're right, with a lot of these things, it is about getting the buy-in at the different levels so that these projects can get off the ground. It seems like with Stroud Commonwealth and Oakbrook Farm, you sort of paved the way for a lot of, you know, these community engagement enterprises that are happening now, and it seems like a very positive thing. Stroud seems to be sort of a 1 in a million place. If you ask me, I'm obviously not from around here, but as I've come in, and you can see that the community really cares about each other. The investment that you said you managed to get is a massive feat. So amazing work. Hopefully it can all keep going and growing as it seems to be in building us back better. So thank you so much, Martin. And I know that there's quite a lot of activity going on in the chat. I think that a lot of them, a lot of people are posting links and a lot of people are answering each other's questions. I'll invite the next speaker to come on now, and then I'll make sure that I'm running through all the questions to pull out any for the Q&A at the end, if that's all right with everybody. Okay, so our next speaker is Rebecca Trevelin. She is the co-founder of the Library of Things and a high street advocate and speaker. The Library of Things is on a mission to make borrowing better than buying, from DIY to gardening, adventuring, cleaning, hosting and hobbying. So another great speaker. Oh, she just dropped off, but she's just back, so fantastic news. Rebecca, can you hear us? Can you unmute? And thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Jenny. I can hear you. Can you?
Oh, we could hear you. Oh, yeah, we can hear you again.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I've just realised I live in a housing cooperative in South London, and it's the time when everybody is on the whole housing co-op monthly meeting, so that I can listen to right in progress. If I pop off, I'll my phone.
Okay, no problem. We'll try for a little while. If not, we can bring you back in whenever. That'd be great. All right, thanks, Rebecca.
Okay, I hang on. Sorry, just give me 30 seconds. I'm gonna use my phone because I can see the internet's not great.
Okay, don't worry. You drop in and out, and I will bring up one of the questions that we've had while Martin was speaking, and we can cover that until you are back in. So I think that Will's responded to this question already. So what social enterprises are taking part in Gloucestershire's local enterprise partnerships? Will, do you want to expand on your response a little bit while we wait?
Yeah, it was. It's hard writing in text, isn't it? It wasn't very positive. I remember speaking to David Owen about 5 years ago, suggesting that social enterprise should be an individual sector in the same way you have the media or I don't know, energy generation, and he was never interested in that. And as an institution, they call themselves structure blind, don't they, in terms of whether you're a business or a CIC or a CBS, they'll give you business advice. And I personally think that's a bit of an error. I think to build back better, we need to have sometimes specialist approaches to things. but they're very nice, lovely people, but I don't think in a strategic sense, the social enterprise sector is particularly on their radar.
Okay, I don't know if Martin, you have anything to add to that. I mean, I know that obviously they're looking at different parts of business, but I mean, with you guys all starting on the social enterprise side of things, there's obviously a need for that as well. So Martin, anything you'd like to add to that? Oh. I think you're on mute, Martin, sorry.
Yeah, I think social business and cooperatives are a bit below the LEP's radar. On the one hand, we're rather small, we can be viewed as somewhat fragile, but if you look at Dale Vince starting out in a caravan at this tinkly bottom field, you know, who would have thought that there would be 900 jobs in Stroud from Ecotricity? So that's the problem with the LEP. I used to work in the Gloucestershire Small Business Unit back in the 1980s. And you know, it's just wonderful working with a range of small enterprises, because you never know where they'll go. and that's why this hub, the real hub concept, is important. So you've got a hub of people like at the Exchange, or Will's got a hub at, is it Brimscombe? And we want to create a farm hub at Oakbrook Farm, you know, so that small businesses like for example, Caroline is, believe it or not, from New York and has just lost a job at Dalesford Organic Dairy, which is run by JCB. And she wants to develop a fermentation business, you know, fermentation food business. Absolutely. That would go like a bomb in Stroud, yeah. You know, and she needs facilities. Yeah. Yeah. So, but this is below the LEP radar, you know, that's sadly. Okay,
that is sadly. I mean, maybe things will change once we start building back better, and these kinds of community enterprises are getting hopefully more on the radar of everybody. So Rebecca's back with us now, hopefully. Rebecca, are you there? And would you like to come in? Yes, we can hear you much better and clearer. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Okay, thanks, guys. Yeah, I'm Rebecca. I'm one of the co-founders of a social enterprise currently based in London called Library of Things. And we help people save money and reduce waste by affordably renting out useful items. So drills, sound systems, sewing machines, strimmers, steam cleaners, all sorts. That's been my focus and work for much of the last 4 years. At the same time, I have been also working in community development in South London, working in a social enterprise hub. Which is a phrase that's come up a lot with what Will and Martin have been saying, and been supporting all sorts of enterprises, whether in repair or food or circular economy or kind of bringing people together. I've been supporting them to happen. And one of the biggest issues I noticed, one of the biggest barriers to that good stuff happening that I noticed in that time was access to affordable, secure, long-term space, property and land, basically, for good community stuff to happen. And there's other barriers as well, funding, networks, things like that. But space is one of the kind of knotty ones. And so I'll talk through that and some of the solutions I've come across to that. Although a lot of it can be summarized by what Martin does. Let's have more of that. So yeah, I'll share my screen and go through a couple of pictures just to bring it to life. Host disabled, screen sharing. I think someone will have to let me share it.
He is just enabling you, don't worry.
All right, nice one.
Okay, you're the host now.
Okay.
I think you might have to give it back to us afterwards, just so you remember, because I think we had a little problem getting it back last time.
Okay. No problem. All right, so a new high street is waiting if we can reimagine access to property. This is already happening in Stroud in a big way, so I don't want to preach to the choir too much. But here's a little snapshot of Library of Things inside a community hub in Crystal Palace in South London, shared community infrastructure, just so you have a little picture of that. So I think one of the things that's come out of the pandemic is a kind of nail in the coffin for the traditional retail focused high street. The media headlines have been announcing that for years, and now with like Amazon sales clocking in like at $11,000 a second at various points in the pandemic, and with 12% of shops empty even before the pandemic started, like I think there's a real realization now that actually like our high streets aren't necessarily going to be all about shopping in the future, and they already aren't in Stroud as it is. But yeah, I think there's a real kind of shift in thinking away from that kind of chain shops and kind of betting shops and empty shops, and more of a move towards something different, some kind of community hub model. And I think what's been really clear, as we've all said over the course of the lockdown, is like actually we're appreciating essentials like food. We're spending less money. We're feeling closer to neighbours and neighbourhoods. Lots of mutual aid groups, community trusts and enterprises are coming into their own and are able to adapt really quickly. And the air is cleaner, and we're noticing more wildlife. So there's like a real mandate for, right, let's change how we do things, and high streets are one focus. And this community hub high street already exists. It exists in Stroud. I've visited the food markets and the various, been on a tour of Spring Hill and things like that. So this is already happening to a large extent where you guys are. But I'll name a few projects that I'm particularly excited by. One is called Participatory City. It's in Barking and Dagenham, East London, a really ambitious £5 million project, taking on 6 different spaces, empty council shops and a massive warehouse space to incubate all sorts of really cool kind of making, mending, repairing, eating, growing, sewing, coming together type businesses, and just doing this like massive push towards like radical participation. Let's get 25,000 people in the borough participating. The idea being that once you get 15% of that population participating, even in a small way, like joining a community dinner regularly, you get this tipping point, and all sorts of community trusts and enterprises and co-ops start to mushroom and blossom in a place. So I'm really excited by that project. In Watchet in Somerset, deprived seaside town, it's kind of been up near the top of the multiple deprivation index. A group of 6 women came together and said, let's do something, and have slowly transformed an empty kind of quayside into a community arts hub, have taken on I've started a museum, have taken on a kind of old paper mill and turned it into a manufacturing plant for green packaging. They've partnered with a startup called Biome to make packaging out of mycelium, out of mushrooms, which is really cool and not necessarily kind of predicted in a small seaside town in Somerset. And then there's cool enterprises in places like Liverpool. This is Home Baked. They're a community bakery. They're a community land trust. They are starting to buy up places to turn into like affordable housing and also community facilities. And so I guess one of my questions has been, why isn't this taking off everywhere? And the realization I came to in South London was that it's just so hard to access affordable, secure, long-term space. And part of the reason behind that is that nearly half of all our high street properties are actually owned by commercial investors, overseas investors, large kind of retail property investors. It's seen as a good investment, and they aren't motivated to rent out property, generally not motivated to rent out locally or affordably. So Impact Hub Birmingham, you might have heard of, amazing kind of innovation space and community co-working space, done all sorts of cool stuff. Ended up paying like 500 grand in rent to this Dubai-based landlord over 5 years, and were presented with like 150 grand dilapidations bill at the end of it, despite having poured like love and soul and money and time into improving the building. And it was just like a story after story of like terrible treatment and just like no interest. The kind of the money was the motivator. And now we have this strange situation where businesses are asking the government to subsidize their rent. It's like, why are we asking our government to use taxpayer money to pay landlords who are already doing nothing and earning, commercial landlords in particular, and earning from that? So so yeah, some issues around kind of motivations, and then there's a kind of issue of like who owns these empty shops. Perhaps there's there might be a mapping type activity in Stroud, so there's a sense of who owns them, but in a lot of cases there's this like real lack of transparency around who these ultimate owners are, because you can go through the land registry to like find the ultimate owners, but often they're a company registered in the Cayman Islands, so you don't know who to contact and how to get hold of them. So one chief executive of a council, Stockton-on-Tees in the north, he said it was like he had to put a team together to do a kind of forensic investigation to find out who owned the empty shops in Stockton, which is interesting. What can we do about it? What's better? How do we build that better? We do as Martin is doing, a lot of what Will's saying. Communities need a stake in their properties. Might be a long-term lease, it might be community ownership, but you just get away immediately from these problems of high rents and high turnover and lack of kind of local accountability, because it's the community that already owns it. So yeah, there's community land trust in in Stroud, but there's also kind of community owned assets of all kinds all around the country, and this is one of my favorites. I was just living nearby over lockdown. It's called the Bevy, more than a pub, based in a working class estate in Brighton, and they're owned. The building is owned by a local land trust that basically gives them the property at zero rent, and so they're able to invest in all sorts of apprenticeship schemes, creating extra jobs, volunteering opportunities, community gardens, dementia clubs, local school cooking classes, all sorts of cool stuff. I know I'm coming to the end of my 10 minutes, so I'll start wrapping up. But basically, like, isn't it amazing what can happen if we take the kind of 20, 30, 50% rent payments out of your kind of business model? And it's not just a question of communities owning property, it could also be local authorities buying property to be a kind of platform for local people to run enterprises from. There has been a big trend of local authorities selling off assets, and unfortunately now that seems to be even more likely. The government's telling them to sell assets, and that's a disaster in my opinion. In certain places like Bristol, like 94% of shops are owned by the public sector, and you there have a kind of thriving independent scene, and all sorts of kind of local business networks and collaborations with grassroots enterprise as well. So how do we get local authorities to keep hold of and keep investing into property on behalf of the community? So what next on a local level? Development funds to be able to buy properties, whether you're a trust or a local authority, and then to improve them once you've bought them. They already exist in Stroud, but development networks and community land trusts that are doing that kind of buying and engagement work and playing a really important role in like interfacing with local needs and wants. And then I think what's been really helpful in other places is kind of a map, local property ownership maps to see who owns what in a town centre. And I know that in Morecambe in the north and in Hastings, they've done some really cool experiments around finding out who owns what to be able to use it for community enterprise. There's all sorts of other stuff on a national level, like community right to buy and national ownership funds and structures, but can't do much about that right now. So yeah, that's what that's what I have found and really inspired by, and what's already happening where you guys are. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rebecca. Another really great presentation, and really appreciate you joining us from London. Loads of really interesting things raised there, you know, from the small scale of sort of lending out individual items. And I think that even stands for businesses. You know, a lot of people just need a sewing machine or just need that, but on short-term basis. And I think investing in something that's so expensive can put them off from starting something or doing something on it if that's wrong. Industrial towns transforming themselves. I mean, I'm from Sheffield, and we have Kelham Island there that's a fantastic community-based project and has totally transformed a really ugly industrial area into a thriving community with eco houses and community-owned buildings and businesses. It's fantastic. So the way it can transform an area and especially one in, like you say, a socially deprived area is really inspiring. Sorry, Will. Okay, we'll get on to Will right now because he's just said he has to leave very soon. Apologies. And Rebecca, if we've got any questions in the chat, I will come back to you afterwards. So Will Frazer is our final speaker. Will is from the National Farmers Union and the Gloucestershire County Council County Advisor for over 1,000 farm businesses in the county, and also the Poultry Advisor for the Southwest. Is the director of a family rural business in Northern Ireland. Will, can you unmute yourself and you can start your 10 minutes. Thank you for being patient and apologies for the wait.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thanks, Will.
Cool. Yeah, sorry, we're just having a slight childcare meltdown going on in the background. So my time is rapidly running out to get tucked away in here. Anyway, I'll give you a bit of background really on what's been happening in the farming industry. I feel like a little bit of the anomaly in the speaker lineup tonight, but anyway, I'll share with you what I know and hopefully some of it's of interest and helps you with your thinking. But I just wanted to make one point first, just on Will's point and the discussion about the LEP. I would really encourage you, if you want to be having those conversations about social enterprise, get your elbows out and get in the door and get in the room now, because all those conversations are starting to happen. I think David Owen is very open to it, and I know for a fact, you know, all of the local industrial strategy and stuff they're trying to work on has to be washed through a community resilience style filter. So I think they would really welcome you know, the inputs that we've heard today into those sort of conversations. So I would have a go again, even if it feels like a bit frustrating. So I just wanted to share a bit, start off just looking a bit at the perspectives of farmers and attitudes just before we went into lockdown and this pandemic hit us. We do a farm confidence survey, which is national every year. The scores range from approximately sort of -20 to +20. So where we were at the start of this year, short-term confidence of farms over the next year or so was around about -11. And this is a drop from about +17 2 years ago, 3 years ago in 2017. So short-term confidence is about as low as it's ever been, really, from a national farming point of view. Slightly sort of midterm, longer term confidence over 3 to 5 years is about -3, and that's is slightly up actually from about -10, which was obviously rock bottom a while back. So we're in a slight, confidence is a big issue in farming at the moment, and it's unsurprising because it feels like we're at a moment of really peak change, and not least because we've been absolutely whacked sideways, both by climate change, being on the direct impact of that, with a lot of our farms being underwater for the last 6 months, and then we've popped straight out of that into a global pandemic, which has knocked many of their businesses sideways in terms of the food chains they supply, and then they come straight out of that into an agricultural drought, where particularly in the east of the county on the Cotswolds, Brash, and around the Forest of Dean on the lighter soils, we've seen grass completely burnt off. People who've been making their hay crops for this year being 50% of what they'd usually be, and they're feeding them already when they should be used for getting the cattle through winter. The rain last weekend came just in the nick of time, but it's still going to be a highly unprofitable year for pretty much every farming enterprise that is outdoor and extensive cropping. So it's and there's a whole bundle of other stuff happening in the agricultural industry in terms of completely rewriting agricultural policy, and our future trading conditions with the rest of the world also being slightly uncertain. So there's a lot going on. I think some of in terms of the confidence survey, the big negatives are really about the input prices, output prices, general economic conditions, short-term impact of Brexit, and the most affected sectors were really the specialist arable and livestock sectors, and this is largely due to the trade restrictions which we might see coming in as a result of Brexit. The big positives, which we've seen, I think, and will be doubled certainly off the back of lockdown and coronavirus, is that about half of farmers thought the biggest opportunity was increased consumption at home in the UK, and more British consumers buying more British produce. And I think that the local food supply demand that we've seen supporting local businesses has certainly helped that cause. And we've done our trade and standards petition for the National Farmers Union, topped 1 million signatures from the general public at the start of this week. 500,000 members of the public signing up to a Back British Farming campaign, and about 80,000 people writing directly to their MPs saying we need to be protecting our standards of production and how we produce food in this country in future trade deals. So I think that's a big opportunity. This is a very positive place to be, to have that kind of support coming behind the farm businesses at a time when their actual physical conditions and their economic market conditions have been very shaky. Just on sectors, horticulture is actually the most confident sector at the moment. It is very challenged by access to labour and having people to come and work on those businesses. Other confident sectors are the poultry and dairy sector. The least confidence are your mixed beef and sheep farms and your combinable crops. So that was where we were before lockdown. The immediate impact of lockdown was absolute bedlam really in the food chain, as we all saw. We saw in those first 4 weeks, I think we saw £1.4 billion extra spent on food and drink directly out of our retail stores. So this was like basically Christmas on steroids for retailers, and in terms of the demand that was suddenly coming through your pack houses, through any of your farms which are directly linked into that retail supply chain. It got very, very busy indeed. And a lot of our farmers have been working round the clock, basically trying to keep those food supply chains working and keep the produce going. So been very, very busy if you are lucky enough to be supplying into the retail sector, into supermarkets. We've certainly seen real success stories in terms of local food, local farm shops and stuff have been really busy, unprecedented demand and loads of local and community support, which is fantastic. And one of the key asks for the recovery is how do we make that stick? Because one of the big concerns we've got is that I guess the retail share of the food chain and of the overall amount of food consumed in the country has gone up, and it was already sky high. They're now controlling, I don't know, probably like 97% of food transactions, mainly because we've lost a load of that out of home eating, restaurants, wholesale, that sort of thing. So they're sitting on a huge power base. They had a huge power base before. It's even bigger now, and so they've got to be really responsible with how they use that. And that's a big challenge. The issue we really had for most of our farms in the county was the collapse of the food service sector. Notably, dairy was the high profile one where we're suddenly seeing, if you see the lockdown hitting, the likes of Costa Coffee, Starbucks, all of these big multiples which shifted a high volume of liquid milk, and those farms which supplied into them suddenly were losing those markets overnight, having to dump milk. And many of those businesses are, down hundreds of thousands of pounds over the last few months without being able to change their cost base, their staffing regime at all, because you can't, cows keep milking. You can't furlough a cow. You can't do anything else with it. You just got to keep going with it. So you can't really change anything. You just got to accept that you're losing your market overnight. And the big issue for that on the food service sector is all about balancing our food chain. So about 20% of the volume of food consumed in the UK is consumed out of the home, in restaurants, in pubs, in cafes and that sort of thing, but that equates to about 50% of the value in the overall food chain. So it's really important part of way, for example, of balancing the whole carcass of a cow going through a processing facility, because the steak cuts, the prime cuts, which make up the value, which goes back to the farmers, they are all consumed in restaurants. And that is where the margin and where the value comes from. You're not getting the margin from buying packs of mince for, you know, £3 in Tesco. That's not paying the cost of production for British farming. So we certainly hit with a lot of challenges. The markets have settled down a lot now in terms of immediate impact. The biggest concern most have at the moment is the dry weather, the lack of grass, and the very marginal crops they're looking at for the coming year. We've started our work on the recovery, what we would like to see be done different, and how do we bounce back. A lot of these things are nowhere near the nitty gritty and the detail of what you've been talking about. You're very close and embedded in the Stroud local community. Unfortunately, I'm slightly more up in the air, covering a whole county, so it's slightly more generic. But you know, we've got to help. Number one, we've got to help our farms adapt to the risk of pandemics and COVID-19. So we're helping them be able to take virtual farm inspections, so they can comply with the regulations, Food Standards Authority, and environmental health regulations and all that sort of thing. And we've also got to make sure that our processing capacity isn't shut down by pandemics. We've seen already that a poultry processing site in Anglesey has had to shut down because it's had an outbreak of COVID-19 in there. We've already seen the capacity go down substantially because of the 2 metre social distancing. So on the cutting lines and that sort of thing, it means you just have far less throughput of product than you normally would. So that's an issue for the function of the food chain as it currently stands. Obviously, we might want to do things a bit differently in the future, but that's a risk for getting food onto supermarket shelves. We've got to help farmers find new and better markets. That might not always be in food. It might be in natural capital and the value of carbon locked up in your land, and the value of protecting our watercourses, and the value of our hedgerows and our trees and our woodlands and biodiversity. So how do we unlock those markets? There's a lot of investment interest in the moment, but how do you bridge the gap between interest and ideas and theory straight down to investment on the ground? So that's something we've got to help with. We really need enhanced sort of business advice and support at farm level. As I said, we're at peak change. Everyone is looking around for what the future is going to look like, and most farms have a very long-term investment horizons. You know, you're investing for a generation, and suddenly you're looking like, what is going to be our next capital investment? It's very hard to figure that out, given it's very hard to know what the world's going to look like in 6 months' time. And at the same time, all of the markets are up and down like a yo-yo, and large amounts of volatility. So we need some good sound advice to support businesses to make decent decisions. We need a more adaptable workforce, really. You know, skills and people coming to work in agriculture has been a real challenge. We work hard with government on a Pick for Britain scheme to try and get harvest workers for this season's crop. In some places that's gone okay, and there's good numbers of British workers going to work on those farms. In other places it has not been that successful. So there's a real mindset and culture challenge there, and how do we get people back working on the land and working in different industries and different types of jobs. One of the things we're really excited about in the county is how do we make our supply chains more local and more dynamic, more resilient. We're working with Gloucestershire County Council on how do they open up their school meals food contract, which is worth about £15 million a year of food consumed, and how do we allow local farmers and food producers access to that contract? Because basically it's just been a 4 or 5 year rolling contract given to a big multiple where the food has no transparency, no traceability, just has to tick certain boxes, and we don't really know where it's coming from. Wouldn't it be great if our farmers who are struggling were able to access that market, which is right on their doorstep? It seems like a bit of a no-brainer. Lots of other things, but I don't think I'll talk about them. I'll just finish by talking about some of the real kind of big strategic changes we're potentially looking at. I think one thing we've got to talk about is the grass. We grow a lot, you know, in Stroud, in where you are in the Severn Vale, there's a lot of grass. It's prime ruminant livestock production area. It's obviously been really strong dairy foothold for a long time. A lot of beef cattle reared there as well. What's the future for that, given changing diets, consumption patterns, but yet the geography there is so ideally suited for it compared to the rest of the world? We need to have a changing approach to crop nutrition. We're seeing a lot of arable and combinable crop farmers now switching to going back to mixed operations, where you're bringing the livestock and the organic matter and the manure directly back in behind the crop, companion cropping as well. So a much more integrated, maybe wouldn't go as far as calling it sort of agroecology, but much more integrated systems coming back to help recycle nutrients, to do things in a more virtuous circle. We've got to have a big look at our protein crops and protein supply. We currently produce about 200,000 tons of peas and beans in this country, but we import the best part of a million tons of soya each year to feed our intensive livestock industry mainly. So how do we actually supply that legume crop, that protein crop locally? That's a huge opportunity. And then the final one, I know it's close to various people in Stroud have spoken to me before about horticulture and how do we grow those enterprises. People mentioning about the market gardens. I've heard an increasing number of those getting up and running in the county. I think that's got to be the growth sector going forward. It's a big part of the transition in the diet that we need to make to protect the planet and help solve climate change. It does come with this odd thing where it's very labour intensive and it's hard to get the people. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation at the moment, because if we had the people and more people willing to do it, I'm sure it would be flying at the moment. Anyway, I will leave it at that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Will. Really interesting. I think so many interesting points that you've made there. I mean, your first one about being an anomaly on the panel, but actually I think that all of the things that have been spoken about before this actually go through the comments that you've made. Everything in terms of social enterprise and allowing people to set up small businesses will help transform our farming and agriculture industries and make them sustainable for the future. And I think it's about not I know that at Oakbrook Farm they were talking about small scale farming. It's about how do we make money off small scale farming and not think that it has to be these huge projects that some people that might not be sustainable anymore. I think that another interesting thing, and I know I'm being very cheeky here, is MPs saying on a surface level that they support our farmers and then actually in Parliament voting maybe not in a way that that represents that. For example, you mentioned flooding, and I know that our MP here voted to not give farmers support for flooding. So I think a few other things that were very interesting, local supply chains, very interesting about the school meals, diversifying farms, looking at social enterprises, how we bring those in. We lived on a farm where they did classes for people with learning disabilities on how to grow vegetables for themselves. Really amazing piece of work, and I think there's so much potential to diversify the farming industry and make it sustainable for the future. So lots of questions. I'll run through them quickly. There was one from Yvonne. Yvonne, would you like me to ask your question for you?
No, I can ask it, thanks. It was just, I wanted to know if there was any idea of shifting away from growing food for animals towards the horticultural growing food for humans in the farming industry.
That one for me then, I suppose.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I mean, I think conceptually and strategically, there's going to be a change. People can see where the change in diet is coming. The reality on the ground is we've got fewer and fewer people working on farms and managing farm businesses with less and less time and being whacked sideways like a pinball more and more often by the economic shocks in the marketplace, by the change to regulation, by the change to policy, and by the impact of climate. So having the time to make that adjustment is going to, and the big thing we need is to help fund that transition. Because at the moment, we've got most of our farmers who, yes, they've been relying on, a lot of them relying on the subsidy payment through the BPS scheme to remain economically viable for a long time. And from next year that starts decreasing a rate of knots down to 2027 to zero, basically, and needs to be replaced with something else. So that's where there's a huge confidence issue. I think most farm businesses are aware there's a massive change agenda coming, but I guess it's not as easy as that, just to say we'll switch off the cows now, or we will stop producing our poultry, or we'll scale back our dairy business and switch to something else, because all of these farms are wrapped up with large scales of capital investment that are on a mortgage repayment to the bank over a long period of time, and can't just be folded very quickly, particularly when the immediate future for cash flow for these businesses looks like it's going south. So how do you actually finance that transition? And if you're going into horticulture, we're listening to someone who was setting up a market garden earlier today. It's £10,000 a polytunnel to get up and running. Then you've got to find the staff, and most of those will be relying on volunteers as well to get those kind of operations up and running. I think there's no doubt that the scale, talking about how do you support a family from a hectare of land and to produce fruit and veg very efficiently and built into local communities, that's absolutely a good thing. It's how do you make the transition from the current business models to those?
Absolutely. So I'm going to some of the other questions. Molly, were your questions specifically for Will? Because if Will needs to leave for his child issues,
it's calmed down a little bit from what I can hear, but
okay. Okay, don't worry. I think Will was having the same, but it seemed to be a Nerf gun war at that end rather than...
Yes, I had a couple of things for Will specifically.
Okay, and then I will scroll through while you ask and check for...
One of them was just relating back to what you've just said, because it's true that the people who are farming the land now have had real trouble making their businesses succeed, and will have more trouble, I think, as the farming system changes. But maybe there needs to be a way of getting different people onto the land who want to grow the vegetables. And I think access to land is a problem for a lot of the young farmers I know who do want to be farming in a different kind of way. And at the same time, we see the land holdings concentrated with a lot of older farmers. And I mean, I think the average age of a farmer is 65 now, isn't it, or something like that. So I'm wondering if we can think of ways of incentivizing farmers to move on, or to allow different people onto their lands who do want to farm in a different way. And then I wanted to ask about the support for, I mean, as a government, you could provide incentives for people to shift towards horticulture and obviously to capture carbon and so on. I'm not entirely sure that's what this government's going to do, but I'd be quite interested in your thoughts on that. And finally, on the procurement, local procurement, we absolutely, as Greens, do want that to happen. So if you want to send a proposal back to us, we can really try and get that organised through Gloucestershire County Council. We've got 2 councillors there, and I don't know if there needs to be a motion put or something, but it's obviously something that should happen and which we would definitely support as Greens.
Thank you, Molly. I'll try and recall those questions. I'll go in reverse.
I've got them written on a piece of tissue paper here, but I can barely read them, so I can prompt you if necessary.
Yeah, the public procurement one is really exciting, and it does feel it's of its time and starting to motor. We've certainly done a fair amount of lobbying in the top of Gloucestershire County Council already, and we have the Council Estate on board. And we're actually running a first webinar to test the water with farmers and food producers across the southwest as a whole tomorrow lunchtime. And I think we've got about 120 different farming businesses registered and interested in that opportunity, which I think is, from our point of view, a fairly strong signal that if the opportunity was there, there'd be plenty of people raring to go and to compete for those contracts if they were to be available. The second, no, my brain is gone now.
Me too. There was what are they going to pay you to do with your land? And is it that the land needs to move to different people who maybe want to farm in this different kind of way?
I think so go to the first one on the next sort of young people and getting access to the land. It's a big issue, and around the Stroud area, you've got a large number of holdings of the county council farm estate. You're absolutely right. I think a lot of those farm tenancies, which used to be starter farms, how you get on the ladder, it might be sort of 40, 50 acres. So you don't have to expend too much capital on getting up and running. you know, they've all kind of become retirement farms now. They haven't moved on. The ladder has stopped working for a long time, and we need to find a way of freeing those businesses up. The issue is that a lot of them are so dilapidated now that the capital costs for a new entrant to come in and get the buildings up and running, to get the fields and the pastures in a fit state, the fencing, the gateways, the hedgerows, everything is a big ask. And the longer that goes on, the bigger the cost it is to get started. So it is a challenge. And I think ultimately the function probably breaks down having to break them into even smaller land parcels, but then how do you make that profitable? And I guess that's when you starting to get closer to the model of community sport and agriculture and market gardening and that sort of thing. I think it's about just the skills and the wherewithal to do it, though. There is certainly a job for joining up and connecting the dots. But I think that the volume of supply and demand needs to ratchet up a notch to actually make it happen. Because at the moment it feels like it's a bit of a niche thing which happens on the side with some joint ventures, but it's certainly not common practice. But I wouldn't be surprised, given you know, the rate of change we're seeing and the scale of impact and challenge at a farm level, that there wouldn't be more interest in the months and years ahead. And then on horticulture, you know, what is it? Martin already mentioned, we only produce 7% of our fruit and veg in this country. 7% of our fruit and 53% of our veg. So huge opportunity to grow those markets of home produced fresh produce. Seems like a no-brainer. I think again it comes down to skills. Comes down, you know, listening to another market gardener earlier. We thought dairy farming was bad and coming to milk the cows. This is the same. You've still got to be up at 4 a.m, harvesting the crops and working a 14-hour shift. And the issue is when we get people coming, we've got quite a few horticultural businesses in the north of the county that have been part of the Pick for Britain scheme. They have consistently been advertising for local workers to come and work there. A lot have turned up. Usually, most of them will last at least one day. Very few last 2, and some only last a few hours before they decide that actually there are better jobs and there's more salary and income to be gained for doing less work elsewhere. And that's the reality of what a lot of those businesses are facing. But again, the economic climate we're entering into and the marketplace might be changing that dynamic slightly.
Thanks, Will, and thanks, Molly, for your questions. I am keen to give Will a break, and so I will just ask one question that was from the top of the chat, and it was sort of a comment and a question interlinked into one about the work of the social enterprises and how do we start moving these volunteer roles, like you said, even you know, on the farms, but also in these community-based projects, into paid roles. And I know that a lot of that is probably around investment and things like that, but let's go for Will Mansell. Would you like to come in on that, moving volunteer roles into paid roles?
I think it's the only way forward. Grace Network doesn't do volunteering. Volunteering at best is a privileged position for someone who's got enough economic freedom to have a bit of fun, turn up, do something. But at worst, they block jobs for people that really need them. Will was just talking about starter farms and how they get clogged up. The same is true with the economy generally, isn't it? If people are willing to work for free, it's quite easy for an organisation to say, we'll have the free labour, which is often older, more educated, more experienced, all that other stuff. So I think, yeah, it's really scandalous, I think, large volunteer-based charities, if they're employing people who are looking for work, particularly of working age. So I think that's where one of the reasons I left the Foodbank as a charity sector thing was effectively because the way in which Foodbank tries to deal with food poverty is to use volunteering to reduce the cost of delivering low quality food to people that are hungry, whereas a more long table kind of model is to say we need to procure food, cook food and eat food in a way which is accessible to everyone. And as part of that, we need to create real value, i.e. making, it's a big P, making the food worth more than the raw parts, and thus you can give that value to those that cook it. So I think the enterprise part of social enterprise is the key there.
Absolutely, thanks. I don't see any other questions. I think there was one question around connecting consumers and farmers, and I think I guess that is sort of an education for everyone in understanding the economics in, you know, the production of food and things. I don't know if Martin, you'd like to come in on that sort of from the small scale farming at Oakbrook.
It's a really good question, and that's why Stroud CSA is so effective with, I don't know, 290 members. So members of the cooperative participate in planning with the farmers and gardeners what's needed over the coming year, and you know, farm visits, come to Oakbrook Farm, come to the micro dairy, come and visit there. But I think we do need education programs as well. And, you know, Will's long tables are just great to have in every neighborhood. And my vision, of course, is allotments everywhere, you know, food growing trees, fruit trees all over Stroud district, you know, so that the barriers are broken down. But, you know, just the experience, however, of industrial farming is incredibly off-putting for a lot of people. So, you know, if you come to Oakbrook Farm at 9 o'clock in the morning, you can see real cows being milked, okay?
And Jenny, if I may comment, I think it was Chloe made a question about moving away from middle-class ideals. How do we make sure that these are accessible? I think that's often an unwritten part of the unspoken bit. Is so much of sustainable is often more expensive and therefore drives out those that haven't got money to engage. And I think that goes back to this community resilience bit. Martin just laughingly mentioned about long table in every community. Our learning from the COVID crisis is actually there's a really simple model where you can get a long table in every community. And what we know is because we have built community relationships with some of the poorer parts of Stroud, which is an area that don't normally engage in sustainability issues, once you've got community connections, friendships, the next phase of actually bringing economic development into an area becomes much easier. So I think there's a real need for those of us who are interested in deep sustainability to think about who we hang out with and trying to make sure that we're building communities in parts that need that extra resilience. And without that, we're going to struggle to penetrate between middle class and other classes. Grace Network's predominantly a working class set of employees. And so that begets more and more working class engagement. And I think the UK is still deeply class divided, and that's a key element for the social enterprise sector to manage. Can't just be middle class double graduates chit-chatting about, you know, posh services. We have to be engaging in community resilience in the deepest, darkest communities of our county.
Absolutely. I think with any kind of change, you know, be it climate, social enterprise, economics, if we don't bring everyone along on the journey, then it will fail over and over again. So absolutely a good point. All right, Molly, cheeky, one more general comment, and then I think we'll have sort of final words from each one of our presenters, and I'll let everybody go to look after their children and or eat something and or go to bed.
Thank you, you're very kind, Jenny. I just wanted to say 3 things to do with the economic crisis we're in that make this sort of community asset model easier. The first one is, I think it's absolutely right to say that we shouldn't be sending money in the direction of landlords. And that was in the first green platform for how to deal with the COVID crisis, whether that's private rents or commercial rents. People are losing value in this crisis, and we have to make sure that it's the people who do the work that lose the least value, and the same in reverse. But we're also going to see a collapse in the value of assets because people won't want to rent property and, you know, won't be able to use other assets as the recession bites. And this is, in fact, how a lot of our community projects in Stroud started in the first place. And so we need to use that opportunity and then build the sort of model Martin was talking about, where people who have money then buy shares in assets that have fallen in value. I mean, the council could do that as well, but it'd be easier probably to organise it through the community, so not waste the opportunity of low asset prices. And the third thing is that it's Co-op's fortnight just for people who didn't know. So it's a very good opportunity to share the word about co-ops, and obviously that's an economic model where no value goes out to people who don't earn it. And again, that obviously stops the concentration of wealth in the hands of people who already own wealth. And so please, maybe for this fortnight, try and shift something that you have in your life away from a capitalist model towards a co-op model, and share the word with your friends.
Okay, thanks Molly for that comment. I think if people want to sort of either respond to that or give a final overview of their thoughts on tonight and some key points, then please do. I'm going to go to Rebecca first, as I know I missed you out on the question, so apologies for that. So definitely take the most time and knock yourself out with a little final say.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, really inspired by everything I've heard. Generally completely agree. I think just to come back to the point that Chloe's question about how do we make sure change is inclusive and doesn't just become a kind of middle class nice to have. I think as well as what Will said, it's about like, yeah, the kind of both intentionally working with those types of groups where they are. I worked with alongside a social supermarket that already had people on government support coming there to shop, basically. And whilst they were there, it was like by the way, do you want to come and get involved in a bunch of kind of parent support groups and community gardening? And yeah, sure, if you want to start a market, go for it. Here's like some space and a tiny bit of funding. And people went mad for it. And it was such a thriving community. And it's not a case of it's not possible. It's just a case of, well, how do we design this for the time availability of those people? And how do we reduce other pressures like housing rent, which could in some cases take out, a third, 50% of income. And yeah, how do you take that pressure off? So yeah, that's my thought. And Local Trust's big local program is worth looking up for that. It's giving £1 million to the 150 most deprived towns and communities in England. And it's had some unbelievable results of kind of, yeah, deprived communities coming together to buy, own, transform assets and transform the towns they're in.
Amazing. Okay, thank you. And thanks for being a panelist on the session tonight. And if there's anything that you would like us to share from what you've said, then please send over the links and we will happily do that. Okay, final thoughts then from William Frazer.
Final thoughts. I think a key part of the very good work that you've always been doing in Stroud. I've only been living in Gloucestershire 4 years, but aware that there's a lot of special things which happen in the Stroud community. As I said, I would definitely be talking to the LEP and the council. Everyone is trying to have a good hard think about how we do this, how we come back in a different way. And I would say, projects like the Long Table have had huge success and huge publicity, really, and I'll be pouncing all over that to try and get in the room with the right people. The final sort of point for me on purely farming perspective is just concerned about direction of travel, and the way future policy is written and could be grounded could drive some slightly perverse incentives away from food production in this country and purely into not just the environment, but I'm certainly aware of quite a lot of farms that are actually wrapping up cropping this year. They're not going to bother or coming out of farming altogether and going wholesale into countryside stewardship schemes or environmental stewardship schemes and putting all of the land down to that. I think that's fine in the right places, but I think it is certainly compromising our ability to produce food in this country in a world which is increasingly uncertain. And also food production and food business, I guess should be everyone's business, and it should be good for local economies and it should work for people. It's maybe failed a bit on that in recent years, but it's an opportunity to be bringing that back to local areas and bringing the value back to local areas. That's it.
Thanks, Will. Thanks. And again, thanks for joining. And please, if you've got anything you can share with us or anything we can get involved with as a community, then let us know. Martin, would you like to come in on your final thoughts?
Well, one learning question I've got is how can we support each other's initiatives and learn from each other more? You know, I get so busy learning from each other and supporting each other. Sometimes I don't do. That's just the general thing. And the second question, an invitation to the Green Party to develop a policy for transferring all the Gloucestershire County Council farm estate into a Gloucestershire farmland trust, which would enable the older farmers Molly's talked about to give their land, donate their land, especially if their children don't want to farm and want to flog it off for a maximum price, but they would like to see their farms continue. So that would be a welcome policy initiative.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Some food for thought there, I guess, as we finish on the session. So last thoughts, final speaker, Will Mansell, would you like to come in? Thanks.
Yeah, I think Molly Becks and then Martin talking about land. I think one of the cores to building back better is understanding land use better, both for environmental and farming stuff. But I think Becks is right around usage of land to be able to start small social businesses. The single biggest risk Grace Network have is our leases aren't very secure. If we get made homeless, we're back to square one. I've been gazumped buying 2 large properties in the middle of Stroud in the last 2 years. And we just can't compete with rich pension holders. And in sort of scary facts, since trying to learn about some of the Black Lives Matter movement, I read an article in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago about the unfair land usage in Rhodesia, as it was once called, where 3% of the population owned over half the land and they were all white. But The Guardian a year ago ran an article saying that in the UK, 1% of the population owned 50% of the land. Now, they're 2 totally different issues, but the discrepancy in power between those who own all the land and those who are trying to do something with it and on it is unsustainable. And it drives so much of this around corporate landlords, around all those things. So from a political perspective, we've got to find ways to reduce, re-regulate, and return that land to common ownership. Otherwise, most of us are stuffed.
Absolutely. And I mean, definitely something to think about. And I think that it's not just an issue, like you say, in other countries, like we do like to point our fingers at other places. But in fact, when we look at ourselves and how we distribute land and how we distribute wealth and power, we're probably one of the worst performing countries if there was a table for that. Okay, so thank you to all our speakers. We've had some amazing points and discussions there. I mean, I think some key themes that came through were around educating ourselves, educating others on different issues, you know, food, community, enterprise, different ways of doing business, transforming our local communities, investment, how we get it, where it comes from, can we invest in each other? And I think investing in each other is really going to be, especially in Stroud, a way to transform how we build back better, and like we say, supporting local, supporting each other. So usually at the end of these sessions we ask everybody to put their cameras back on, sort of give us a wave, tell us that you're still there and you're still all awake, and thank you so much for joining us.